You are listening to Proof Text, a Glossa House podcast exploring Scripture and all things related to it. New episodes are released daily. For more information, check out glossahouse.com and subscribe to our channels on Spotify and YouTube. Welcome and enjoy.
Friends, hello and welcome to Proof Text and Glossa House TV. I am Dr. T. Michael W. Halcomb, and in this episode, I'm going to share some of my recent Substack posts with you. I've started a new series on, it's titled The Liberal Twisting of Jesus' Command to Love Your Neighbor. And so I'm going to read part 1 and part 2, the first two parts, in this video. And then next week we'll have parts 3 and probably part 3 and part 4 on here. I think this is an important topic. I've talked about love on the podcast before, but also want to just put you on to my Substack. You can find it at michaelhalcomb.com, and there's a menu up at the top that says Substack, or you can just go to tmichaelwhalcomb.substack.com. and you'll find it there. I'm going to show that on the screen here, and you'll be able to see it. If you're just listening, of course, that's fine too. Just check out tmichaelwhalcomb at .substack.com. So let me go back here, and you'll see a host of posts there. So from time to time, I'm going to read these on here. Let's start with part 1. Okay, let me zoom in here. Growing up, much of my childhood was spent in a trailer park where the cast of neighbors could only be described as, eclectic. There was Jim, whose trailer had CB antennas all over it so he could talk with truckers and follow police updates. He tinkered with cars year-round in his driveway and entered demolition derbies as if his life depended on it. Then there was Ron, the guy who was deep into rap music, disappeared into the military, and came back all about white power. I can't forget Paul, who seemed to have a cigarette in one hand, a beer in the other, and a curse word ready to fly at anyone who rubbed him the wrong way. It was the kind of neighborhood where you were never quite sure if the next conversation would end in laughter or a fistfight. So when people throw out Jesus' words to love your neighbor, instinctively I often think back to that wild assortment of characters to my old trailer park. But then I have to stop and ask myself, was Jesus telling us that we need to love every single person living next door, no matter who they are? Not exactly. When Jesus spoke about neighbors, he wasn't just talking about whoever happens to live next door. His command wasn't an open-ended call to embrace the whole world with equal fervor. Besides, to say, I love everyone, while it'll score you some virtue signaling points today among the left, is really just the same thing as saying, I love no one. It's impossible to love everyone, so let's stop making such dull and pointless statements. Anyway, as Dr. Dre might put it, back to the lecture at hand. To understand what Jesus meant by neighbor, we need to dig deeper into the world of Scripture and the world out of which Jesus spoke, something that's often ignored in today's shallow interpretations. First, it's crucial to remember that ancient Jewish society was collectivist and largely tribal, which is quite different from our individualistic culture today. Villages were typically made up of people from the same ethnic group, and in larger cities like Corinth or Ephesus or Rome, different areas were dominated by distinct ethnic or religious communities. Even within Israelite circles, and by the way, Israelite is a larger umbrella catch-all term, while Jew is much more narrow, towns, cities, or villages would be split up by various religious tribes, such as Pharisees, Sadducees, and so on. It reminds me of modern-day San Francisco, where you've got neighborhoods like Chinatown or Little Italy, or even today's ethnic and culture-based churches, Greek Orthodox, Korean Presbyterian, Black Gospel congregations, etc. The point is, in Jesus' world, your neighbor wasn't just some random person who moved in next door. That didn't happen. No, your neighbor was someone from your own ethnic and religious tribe. Second, this is why when Jesus issues the command to love your neighbor, he's drawing directly from Leviticus 19. It's often lost on modern readers, but Leviticus is clear about who qualifies as neighbor. In Leviticus 19:18 we read, "You shall not take vengeance, nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord." Question: who are the sons of your people? The Israelites, the covenant people of God, are those in view. And later in Leviticus 19:34, the text makes a distinction. "The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as the native among you." And so while strangers were to be treated with kindness, they were not the same as neighbors. Strangers were those outside the covenant community, and this is key to acknowledging and making sense of things as we read thousands of years removed. Enemies, of course, fell even further outside that circle. This distinction between neighbor and stranger and enemy is foundational for understanding Jesus' command. There's a different level and kind of love for each. Third, when Jesus speaks about loving your neighbor in Mark 12:28-31, he's talking to fellow Jews. And he's using Jewish scripture. Location, as always, is key. Jesus is in Israel, in Jewish Jerusalem, in the Jewish temple, during a Jewish holiday, talking to Jews and Jewish leaders using Jewish scripture. He's not redefining the term neighbor for a 21st century audience. He's speaking to an audience who understood neighbor in the Levitical sense. Jesus is referring to a fellow member of the covenant community, the people of God, spiritual brothers and sisters. The Israelites, or of different stripes, listening to him, especially Jews, would have understood this because it was their scripture, their tradition, and their way of life. They knew that neighbor didn't just mean anyone out there. It meant a fellow Israelite, someone bound by the same covenant relationship with God. And so some will try to counter this by pointing to the parable of the Good Samaritan. What about the Samaritan, they ask? Wasn't he considered a neighbor? Yes, but with an important caveat. The Samaritans were a group of Israelites who had intermarried with other nations and adopted different practices. And while they were seen as not fully Jewish, they were still Israelites, still part of the broader covenantal story, even if the relationship was strained. The Samaritan in Jesus' parable is not an outsider in the way we think of outsiders today. He's a wayward covenant member, not a foreigner or stranger in the fullest sense. Jesus' choice of Samaritan wasn't about broadening the definition of neighbor to include every person on earth. It was about challenging the Jewish exclusivity toward a fellow Israelite group that had been marginalized. And honestly, this point can't be stressed enough, so let me say it again. Jesus' choice of Samaritan wasn't about broadening the definition of neighbor to include every person on earth. It was about challenging the Jewish exclusivity toward a fellow Israelite group that had been marginalized. So what's the point? What does this mean for readers thousands of years on in vastly different locations and contexts? It means that when Jesus commands us to love our neighbor, he's not talking about everyone in the world indiscriminately. He's talking about our fellow believers, our brothers and sisters in the faith, those who are part of God's covenant people. That's who our neighbor is. Of course, we're all called to love others outside the faith. There's no question about that. But the kind of love Jesus is talking about here, the kind of love that prioritizes care and compassion, is directed primarily toward those who share in the covenant of faith. I once saw a Nazarene pastor wearing a shirt that read, "Love your blank neighbor," and then filled in the blank with a long list. Your LGBT neighbor, black neighbor, Hispanic neighbor, disabled neighbor, and so on. You get the point. Fill in the blank with every minority group so you can make yourself look good, like a true social justice warrior, and score as many points of the virtue signal as possible. It's the kind of shirt that's become popular in liberal theological circles, one that's designed to show how inclusive and open-minded the wearer is. But it's also the kind of shirt that fundamentally misunderstands Jesus' teaching. Jesus wasn't telling us to flatten the moral landscape and treat every person the same way, regardless of their relationship to the covenant community. He's drawing on a rich tradition of covenantal love that prioritizes those who are part of God's people. This doesn't mean we're not called to love those outside the faith, but it does mean that the deep sacrificial love Jesus speaks of is primarily directed toward our fellow believers, our fellow covenanters. It's not just any old person like the cast of characters in my old trailer park. Should I show kindness to people like Jim and Ron and Paul? Absolutely. But the kind of covenantal love Jesus is talking about is reserved for those within the family of faith, the people of God. And this matters because in today's world, this teaching has been twisted to mean something entirely different. People are using it to push a shallow, generic love for all that waters down the rich, deep love Christ calls us to show for our spiritual family. In part 2, we're going to dive into the second half of this discussion, what Jesus meant by love. But for now, let's hold on to this truth. Jesus wasn't just telling us to love every person indiscriminately. He was calling us to a deeper covenantal love for our fellow believers, the people of God. And that's something we desperately need to recapture in our churches today. And so that's part 1. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to go on to part 2, and we're going to talk about love. All right, so let me go back here. Here we go. Hopefully these will flow nicely together for you. All right. For the last year and a half, I've been researching, writing, presenting, preaching, and teaching on one of the most talked about, and at the same time, what seems like one of the hardest to pin down subjects in all of Scripture: love. I've surveyed every single use of love in the entirety of Scripture from Genesis to Revelation. And while I don't dive headlong into every usage here, I'll say that after countless hours of study, prayer, and reflection, I've come to one unmistakable conclusion. Scripturally speaking, love bends its arc toward God's covenant people. The Bible doesn't talk about love in the general, all-encompassing sense that our culture would have us believe. No, it's far more specific, far more focused. In fact, after all of the study, I've come to define love this way: wanting God's best for the other and nurturing an environment for that to happen. That's it. Simple, right? But this definition raises a crucial question. What exactly is God's best? Is it what I think is best? What you think is best? What the culture thinks is best? Absolutely not. God's best for us, as my friend Jeremy and I have repeatedly talked at length about, is quite simply Himself. But in terms of how that plays out in our ethics, actions, and everyday lives, God's best is a life of holy obedience and surrender, a life modeled on and after Jesus Himself. God's best is a life of submission to His will, a life lived in accordance with His commands. After all, if you love Him, as He says, you'll obey Him. And this kind of life, this holy life of surrender, occurs chiefly within the covenant community and is lived out together among fellow believers. This isn't to say it's never lived out when we're not among our fellow covenanters. Of course, it is. It's always lived out no matter where we are. But it's our community of faith that shapes us and prepares us and helps equip us to remain faithful as part of the faithful, even when, physically speaking, we're apart. But the problem we're facing today is that our culture has completely hijacked, warped, and redefined love into something senseless and incoherent. We're told over and over again that love is love is love, as if that tautology somehow explains everything. But it's just that, a tautology, a logical fallacy. It explains nothing. And worse, it distorts the rich, deep meaning of love that we see in Scripture. The culture has co-opted the idea of love, stripped it of its biblical context, and turned it into something meaningless. Christians must resist this at every turn. We need to recover a biblical view of love and resist these gross misinterpretations with every fiber of our being. So what does Scripture say about love? Let's dig into the language of love from the passages we looked at in the first part of this series, starting with Leviticus 19:18 and then moving to Mark 12:28-31. In Leviticus 19:18, the Hebrew word used for love is ahav or ahev. This word at its core signifies an enduring affection or loyalty, often in the context of covenantal relationships, just like chesed. We need to stop pitting these two Hebrew terms against one another in the name of nuance, by the way, as though one word means something incredibly different from the other. They overlap in meaning. The Greek term used here in the LXX or the Septuagint is agapao, the verbal form of the noun agape. Here, love isn't a fleeting emotion or a warm, fuzzy feeling. It's a committed, steadfast love that seeks God's good for the other, a love rooted in a shared covenant with God. This is the kind of love that's expected within the covenant community of Israelites. Love for one another. Love that reflects God's covenantal faithfulness. It's about wanting God's best for your fellow Israelite and nurturing an environment where that can flourish. Now, in Mark 12:28-31, where Jesus reiterates the command to love your neighbor, the Greek word for love is, as in the LXX above, agapao, a term that carries with it the idea of self-sacrificial love, the kind of love that puts the other's needs above your own. But what's key to understand is that agapao in this context isn't just some generic love for humanity at large. Jesus is still talking about covenantal love, the same kind of love that was commanded in Leviticus. It's love, a love directed toward fellow believers, toward those within the covenant community. Agapao here in Greek, like ahava or ahev in Hebrew, isn't about abstract feelings of goodwill toward strangers. It's about concrete actions of care, protection, and nurturing for those who share in the covenant relationship with God. It's about wanting God's best for your brothers and sisters in the faith and doing whatever you can to create an environment in which that can happen. It's not passive. It's active, and it's rooted in obedience to God's commands. And this is crucial because our culture has twisted this understanding beyond recognition. We're told by theological liberals that we need to love like Jesus. But the Jesus they're presenting to us is a Jesus they've created in their own image. As Albert Schweitzer pointed out long ago, when you strip Jesus of his historical context, you're left with a figure who conveniently looks and sounds and acts exactly like you. And that's what's happened today. Many theological liberals have created a Jesus who affirms their agendas, who speaks in their progressive tones, who would never dare challenge their worldview. And part of that distortion is found in their redefinition of love. But how do we know their definition is wrong? What's the easiest way to identify that their version of Jesus isn't the real Jesus of Scripture? Simple. Look at how they've twisted the definition of both neighbor and love. They've pulled these concepts out of their scriptural context, out of the covenantal framework that Jesus himself was working within. They've taken what was meant to be a deep covenantal love for God's people and turned it into a shallow, generic love for everyone. But in doing so, like Andy Dufresne, who hollowed out his Bible to hide his chisel in Shawshank Redemption, they too have hollowed out Scripture to escape its covenantal claims and expectations. They've demoted the covenant and its people, putting them on the same level as those outside the covenant, effectively watering down the very thing that makes the covenant community distinct. Here's the point. Loving your neighbor, as Jesus taught, isn't about loving every single person in the world equally. It's about loving your fellow covenanters, those who are part of the family of God, those who are bound by the same covenant relationship with Him. That doesn't mean we don't show kindness to others, but it does mean that there's a special kind of love that's reserved for the people of God. And that love is directed toward wanting God's best for them, which is a life of holy obedience and surrender. So where do we go from here? Well, in part 3 of this series, I'll talk about ordering our loves, what that looks like and why it's necessary. But for now, let's hold on to this. Love in the biblical sense is about far more than feelings. It's about action. It's about nurturing an environment where God's best can happen, and is primarily directed toward our fellow believers, our fellow covenanters. Let's not allow the culture to twist that into something beyond recognition, something it was never meant to be, something that is definitely not God's best for us. And so stay tuned. Next week, we'll probably have parts 3 and 4 on here on the audio and video podcast, Proof Text and Glossa House TV. But if you want to read, the post will be live before then. Just go to tmichaelwhalcombe.substack.com and subscribe there. All right, friends, I'm going to stop there and say I hope that helped.
Interested in growing your ancient language skills but not sure where to start? Glossa House can help. From illustrated readers and short stories to lexicons and grammars, Glossa House offers a variety of resources for beginning, intermediate, and experienced ancient language learners. Head to glossahouse.com today. Glossa House, language resources for the global community.